All right. Hope you can see that. I know the lights are bright enough that it makes my overheads a little bit dim, but hopefully you can kind of make out what we have up here. But when we think about the Assyrian Empire, we are thinking about the largest empire to date, that is up until that time in history. This map that I'm showing you here shows two different eras of Assyrian history. One of them, if you can read it, says 824. That's the earlier period of Assyrian expanse. This is early in the era that's associated with the divided monarchy in Israel, and the darker green region really shows Assyria at that point. Then later, at really even a higher point under Ashurbanipal, there's even more of an expansive region, and that's kind of the lighter green area that you'll see there. It goes all the way down through Palestine, of course, deeply affects Israel. The people of God reaches clear down into Egypt. So it's quite a dominating and powerful empire that, at least for a time, was certainly the force to be reckoned with in the world. Assyriologists, as they're called, as they've tried to trace the history of this people, have divided it up into various eras, and we're going to look at about the first three of these this morning. The first of these is called Proto-Assyria, which means the Assyria before Assyria, and really the story here has more to do with the city of Ashur, A-S-S-U-R, and not so much a region, and so we're going to start there. Now I'm going to remind you, you've been in the class. This will be a little bit of review, and review is good for you, so you pay attention. There will be a quiz, but you'll recall when we were talking about Mesopotamia, we talked about three great dynasties that begin first of all with Sumer, and then we have Akkad, the first king was Sargon, then we have Ur. And Ur, the third dynasty of Mesopotamia, was that area where Abraham was born, probably around the year 2000, maybe about the year 1950 or so, something like that. So that's the material we've reviewed already. Well, when Ur falls, that central authority over all of Mesopotamia is lost. And so we enter into a period that was called an intermediate period, in which there's no centralized authority, and that lasts for about 200 years. In the south, the two cities that were vying for control were Isin and Larsa. And in the north, the two were Eshnunna and Ashur. So that's our first interest in this city that gave its name to the empire that would eventually emerge from it. And so we have Ashur, as you'll see, way to the north. It's on the Tigris River, and Eshnunna is the one that's a little bit lower there. So after the fall of Ur, this city, it's the first time it really pops up on the radar screen of ancient history, asserts its independence and is able to maintain itself for a period of time. It forms trading ties with the Hittites. We talked about this last time we were together, and so they have a nice relationship that lasts for a while. The Amorites are people, we've talked about them before as well. They were kind of a ubiquitous tribal group. We find them in Canaan. We also find them sometimes in Egypt. We see them certainly in Mesopotamia. They seem to insinuate themselves into this era, into this region, and gradually come into a kind of a leadership role. So the Amorites, mentioned in the Bible, also seem to be the ones that begin to elevate Assyria to a somewhat higher level of power and authority and so on. In 1870, roughly, we have the first actual biblical mention of those who appear to be the Assyrians. They're not called by that name, but in Genesis 14 we hear of an attack by a king who is given an Amorite name, the name Chedorlaomer, or Chedorlaomer as it's usually rendered in the Bible, and he comes sweeping down and attacks Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis 14. We wouldn't care about that a bit. Just one more raid, in the ancient world, except, of course, who was captured in that raid on Sodom and Gomorrah? Answer? Lot and his family. And, of course, Abraham musters his private army. We're told it's 318 soldiers born in his own house, goes out in hot pursuit, rescues Lot, rescues the family, brings back the booty, and that gives rise to that wonderful story of Abraham confronted by the king of Sodom and the king of Salem. You recall that, Melchizedek, of course, receives tithes from Abram at that point. That's the first time in the Bible we hear of what eventually will become the Assyrians. They're not much yet, but at least we have that little cameo appearance, as it were, of these people showing up. In 1770, we have Hammurabi's empire, the old Babylonian empire, and it really does kind of sweep through all Mesopotamia, reaches up, grabs Ashur in the process. That doesn't last for too long. So by 1700 down to about 1500, we have once again a time of Assyrian independence, really just the independence of the city itself. And then, now this, I have to hang on to this for a minute. This is a little bit of review once again, but hopefully it'll help us as we work our way through this. Assyria is conquered by a group that's called the Mitanni. Most folks have never heard of them because they don't show up in the Bible, and they only show up kind of quickly in ancient history, but for a while they were a somewhat dominant power. They were Hurrian speaking. Now that means they spoke an Indo-European language, just as we do. And they came down from the north, and they kind of shoved their way in to this region that was otherwise dominated by the Hittites on the one hand and the Assyrians on the other, and they actually take over for a period of time. And so those are called the Mitanni. They were part of what's sometimes called the Great Powers Club of the ancient world for a brief time. And so Assyria comes under their dominance. And that really rounds out the first part of this story of Assyria. So I've gone through that pretty rapidly, but hopefully a little bit of his review, and that really is more concerned with the city of Ashur than any sort of empire as such. This brings us to the next era, which is a little shorter. It's called, usually by Assyriologists, Early Assyria. This is when it finally begins to become more of a region than just a city. It begins with a king whose name is Ashur-uballit. By the way, Ashur was the name of the chief deity of the Assyrians, so you see that word showing up fairly frequently. He joins our friend, the Hittite king Suppiluliuma. Remember him? How remember that guy? Suppiluliuma, great guy. Now remember, just to help you connect dots here, Suppiluliuma is a king of the Hittites when the Hittites were really at their power during the early period of the Israelite judges. And he brings an attack from the north, remember that? On a region called the Phoenicians. At the same time that the Phoenicians were in a squeeze play from a group on the south who were called the, oh, I don't hear you, the Apiru. Remember that? Nod your head. Oh yes, I do remember that. Please, thank you. I need positive reinforcement here. All right, and the Apiru is an ancient Near Eastern term that is probably the root of what word? Hebrew. At least so say some pretty respectable ancient Near Eastern scholars, and I don't count myself as a scholar by any means, but I do tend to agree that that's probably the roots of that word. So you have the Apiru, possibly the Hebrews, these who are now in the era of the judges, who are pushing out the boundaries of their region there in Israel, as we eventually would call it, and they're squeezing the Phoenicians, and hence these letters are written to Akhenaten, you recall that, in Egypt, and he turns a deaf ear. We've been through all that. All right, the same Suppiluliuma forms a treaty with Ashur-uballit, and they together decide to put the squeeze on the Mitanni. And so they attack from both sides, and that is the end of the Mitanni and the beginning of the Assyrian Empire, at least the beginning of an Assyrian kind of dominant region, we'll say that. The Mitanni are driven out. We don't hear anything again from them again. And at this point, Ashur-uballit is able to establish a kind of regional presence and power that came to be called Assyria. He raised the standard of Assyrian brutality. There is absolutely no ancient civilization more famous for its gratuitous violence and ghastly forms of torture than the Assyrians. They would simply terrify people into submitting to them. And there are ghastly descriptions of some of the things they did, and many of those descriptions are found in this book. So this is not good bedtime reading, you know. But nevertheless, it does describe piling up corpses, skulls, flaying people alive, the kind of things junior high kids like to hear about. And I'm not going to bother you with more of it, but it was awful and horrific, and it only got worse for quite a period of time. That's part of the reason, by the way, the Assyrians were universally hated in the ancient world, was because of this very brutal kind of reputation they had. Suppiluliuma himself was so worried about this rising kind of brutal military power from Ashurbanipal that he actually put in a buffer state here to insulate himself from the Assyrians. He put one of his sons at Carchemish, one of them at Aleppo, and he's trying to create a little bit of a distance then between himself and the Assyrian power. We have a few minor kings. We won't bother with them. The next guy we're interested in is Adad-nirari. Adad-nirari rules from 1308 to 1275. And again, for those of you who've been in the class, this will have a little bit of a feel of review to it, I hope. But, by the way, there's a digital shot. These guys all look the same, I don't know about you, but they all look the same to me. But they were all very proud of their visage, so I don't know. Anyway, this is one of the first artifacts we have of this particular guy, Adad-nirari. After the Battle of Kadesh, ring a bell? The Battle of Kadesh, the greatest international battle to date, 1276 BC, between the Hittites and the commander Hattushili of the Hittites and Ramses II, known as Ramses the Great, takes place at Kadesh, that city in northern Syria. Both sides kind of bloody each other up and go home and leave that piece of real estate more or less unprotected for a time. And so what happens is this particular ruler, Adad-nirari, sweeps in and grabs a chunk of northern Syria, not too far from the people of God who are down in Israel. And so this is the first time that we've got the Assyrians in our backyard. Now, we don't hear about that in the book of Judges. It doesn't really play into the story there, but it is interesting to us that now the Assyrians are beginning to show up and make their presence a little bit more dominantly conspicuous. This is a dramatic expansion of Assyrian power, but he dies in 1275, the year after the Battle of Kadesh, and it brings the next guy, Shalmaneser, 1275 to 1244. He continues to push the borders of Assyria, pressuring the Hittites, and Hattushili, who had fought Ramses, the two of them had fought at the Battle of Kadesh. Hattushili realizes we have a common enemy that's worse than the two of us are toward each other. And so he actually sends an email to Ramses, says, "Hey, bud, remember that battle we fought a few years ago? I've got a better plan. Let's get married, And so Hattushili actually sends a daughter to Ramses to become one of about 100 wives that Ramses had. I don't know if he ever met her, but there she was. And they formed this kind of liaison, a joint defense agreement intended to resist the encroaching Assyrian threat that both of them are feeling. And this gives rise to the earliest international treaty that's ever been discovered. We talked about this a few weeks ago. This is the tablet of the first international treaty. This was written in a cuneiform alphabet. It was a Hittite document. It's presently at the Istanbul Archaeology Museum. It was dated to 1272, so 4 years after the Battle of Kadesh, the Hittites and the Egyptians join in a league against the Assyrians. Okay. The tablet was found, by the way, by Hugo Winkler. And if you were here when we talked about the Hittites, you recall he's the guy that really discovered the Hittite civilization and actually discovered this stone tablet, although he wasn't able to read it. That took later scholarly effort. So that's Shalmaneser, and he's the guy that represents the cause of this international agreement, as we say. The last guy kind of starts losing power, so we have Tukulti-Ninurta, who begins to retreat a little bit. It's too wide, too far flung, he can't sort of support this kind of expansive territory, and so he begins to recede a bit, and it introduces the period that's called Assyrian decline. So the third of our eras of Assyrian history is the period of decline. This goes from 1208 to 911. This is interesting. Assyria basically goes dark And sometimes you'll find ancient Near Eastern scholars refer to this as a kind of dark age, because everybody goes dark. We don't hear anything from the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans were basically seem to have been conquered and sort of demobilized by the sea people that came in. You recall we've talked about them. The Hittites are neutralized. Over the Assyrians go dark. The Babylonians, hear nothing of them. Even the Egyptians become quiet. The entire ancient Near Eastern world, for a period of about 250 to 300 years, is silent with one notable exception. What's the exception? Israel. It's a very interesting thing, isn't it? That the moment of Israel's great golden kind of civilization, the rest of the world is quiet. Now this brings me to the first half of my Sunday school lesson for the morning. And it's based on Proverbs 17:6. If a man's ways please the Lord, he will make even his enemies to be at peace with him. Amen? You know something? Even people that don't like you will quiet down a little bit if your ways please the Lord. And there was a time in Israel's history when her ways pleased the Lord. David was a man after God's own heart. And God blessed him with a son, a prototype really of Christ, who built a house. Christ would build a vastly greater house, as you know, but he built a house, Solomon, and God blessed it. And isn't it interesting that the entire ancient world goes quiet? And so we don't know much about what happened, and I'm going to use this as an excuse to do a little footnote. So I'm going to drop now to the bottom of the page. This is an extended footnote in which we're going to talk about kind of the basic chronology of the events in Israel during the United Monarchy, because there's not much else to talk about, and I want to tuck this in here somewhere, so that's what we're going to do. This, as I say, is regarded as kind of a dark age. The most important ruler of the time from the Assyrian point of view was Tiglath-Pileser I, who did some stuff, you know, but we don't really care because it doesn't affect biblical history all that much. But he gives his name to Tiglath-Pileser III, who becomes a major character somewhat later. But as I say, it is a period that represents Israel's golden age. So let's shift our focus for a moment and think about the basic chronology of what takes place during this couple of hundred years of Israel's history. You all learned this years ago in Sunday school. I'm just reminding you of it now. So it should all come back to you. Those wonderful Sunday school teachers you had, as I did back in 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, who taught all this stuff. So now we just kind of tuck it in where it belongs here in history. Saul is the first of these three kings, of course, born about 1080. He's anointed by Samuel to be the first king in about the year 1050. Samuel is the last of the judges. So this entire period that we call the era of the judges, starting with Othniel, you know, Ehud, some of those guys, Samson, Jephthah, Deborah, so on. Those are the judges. The last and greatest of them is Samuel. He represents the transitional moment. He is guided by God against his own, you know, kind of objections to anoint Saul as the first king, and that's probably about the year 1050, right smack in the middle of this ancient Near Eastern dark age. Saul, however, doesn't do well. Early on, he disobeys God's command to him through Samuel to wipe out the Amalekites in a kind of holy war, because the Amalekites had been the perennial enemies of Israel going clear back to the days just after the Exodus. You may recall we covered that some time back, some weeks back. And so Saul is only half-hearted in carrying out God's command, and for that reason his rule begins to deteriorate. About 1040 we're going to have the birth of David, and that would put the conflict with Goliath at about 1023, when David was probably a teenager. Who is Goliath? Probably a mix of the Mycenaeans and the Sea people. He's not native Canaanite. We know the language, we know the pottery, we know the artifacts, we know all the culture of the Philistines. It's been very, very heavily excavated, And we know that they were not the same as native Canaanites. They were quite foreign, really, to the otherwise standard Canaanite population. They show the greatest similarity to the Mycenaeans. We'll talk about them at a later time. And so these Philistines are in a kind of a class by themselves. And it's possible, I won't say probable, I'll just say hypothetically possible, that Goliath may have been a descendant in some sense of Agamemnon, the great king of Mycenae who fought with the Trojans and so on in the Trojan War. That's all history. We'll talk about it another time. But nevertheless, it does seem that they were a warrior class that was a little bit different from the average Canaanites otherwise. David takes down Goliath, that great story there that we find in the Old Testament. David's on the run then after he's served the king for a couple of years. And for the last 10 years or so of Saul's reign, Saul is in a kind of paranoia, and if you know the story, it ends pretty darkly until he finally dies with his son Jonathan on Mount Gilboa. So there's basically the chronology of Saul's life. David is anointed king of Judah, of the tribe of Judah, in the year 1010. There's a civil war that goes for about 7 years until he finally rules the entire domain of Israel. 1003 is when he's crowned king of the entire region. 1002, he conquers Jerusalem, which had been ruled by the Jebusites. You recall, it had been an independent city. And then in 1000, David brings the ark to Jerusalem, just about exactly the year 1000. Very interesting coincidence of numbers. There's a little misstep there. You recall the story of Uzzah, a Kohathite priest who was charged, among other things, with carrying the ark correctly. That would mean on poles. They put it on an ox cart. That was bad enough. And then when the oxen stumbled, of course, Uzzah reaches out to steady the ark. Didn't want that ark to fall into the mud and get defiled. Remember that story? What was the most defiled thing in the presence of the ark? Uzzah. And of course, when he reaches out and touches the ark, of course, it's like the last straw, and God strikes him dead, which did shake David up a bit, And we know, if you read the story, that David decided he didn't want this ark in Jerusalem after all, if people are going to be dropping dead like this all the time. And so it was kind of stayed for a short time at a person's residence, and that person was greatly blessed by the presence of God's ark there. So finally it does get to Jerusalem. And then it's at that time, probably about the year 1000, we have the Davidic covenant. Now there's several covenants in the Old Testament, but 3 of them stand out as they're all important, but 3 in particular stand out as the most important. The first covenant is with Abraham, the second one with Moses, and the third one with David. You know those 3. There are others, but those 3 really kind of occupy center stage in the Old Testament. All of them point emphatically to Christ. So the Abrahamic covenant is a covenant with Abraham and his seed. And the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapters 3 and 4 makes it quite clear that the seed of Abraham is in the first instance Christ. Paul says he doesn't say seeds, as if many, but one, which is Christ. And then David proceeds to say, Paul proceeds to say, if a person is connected to Christ by faith, then he is in Christ, then he can derivatively call himself seed of Abraham. So it's not by birth, it's not by some kind of sacramental status or any such thing, but finally it is being connected with Christ by faith. And that's the New Testament posture. And it was a quite controversial proposition, of course, from the Jewish point of view in the first century. So that's the first covenant. The second one is with Moses. The centerpiece, of course, of Moses' great legislation was sacrifice. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and so on. All of these point again to Christ, who is the Lamb that takes away the sin of the world. And so we have in the Mosaic covenant this great pointer to Christ. And then with David, the third of these, we have the third great pointer, because part of the promise that was made to David was that he would have a son. You recall David was hypothesizing one day with the prophet Nathan. He says, I think I'll build a house for God. Nathan said, Go for it. Then Nathan came back the next day and said, oops, sorry, new word from the Lord. Don't go for it. You say, I will build a house for God. God says, I will build a house for David. I will build David's house. And the house that David will have built for him by God, this dynasty that is going to be constructed by God, will culminate in one who is called what? The Son of David. And that one, the promises to David, will rule forever over the house of Israel. And of course, one of the names par excellence for Christ in the New Testament was the Son of David. It was a controversial phrase. It was a politically loaded title. But Jesus permits it to be applied to himself. And when he says to his disciples just before the ascension, all authority is given unto me, and he ascends to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords, he richly consummates the great promise to David. So the point is, these three covenants, the others also, but those especially point to Christ. And it's about the year 1000 that promise is made to David, and that really is the heart of this period where the rest of the world is quiet and God is richly blessing his people. Of course, nobody's perfect. Even David had his slip up, and we have the Bathsheba incident. 3 years later, probably, the child born of that unfortunate relationship died, but then the next child that was born to them, probably about the year 995, was named Solomon. He survived. And Solomon, of course, is the successor. The rebellion and death of Absalom, the son of David, was probably about 10 years later. Finally, David's death itself is in about the year 970, and that brings then the third of our three kings of this era to the throne, who is Solomon. He was 25 years old when he became king. He conspicuously distinguished himself for his wisdom, of course, right off the bat. You know the stories connected with that. But we're especially interested in the fact that in the year 967 or thereabouts, he launches the construction of the great temple. Now, what's interesting about this is that there is a huge amount of concurrence among scholars. Even liberal scholars will generally agree that the date of the building of the temple would be about this time. And from this point on, the chronology is pretty well not so controversial. Earlier dates tend to be more murky, as I've hopefully reminded you many times. By this time, we can be pretty precise. And so there's a fair amount of confidence that the temple was built or constructed, the beginning of it took place in 967. Why is that important? Because the text at that point says that the Exodus took place exactly 480 years before the beginning of the building of the temple, and that puts us at 1447, and that's why that's the date I assumed for our discussion of the Exodus. If you've been in the class, you recall that. It is a little bit controversial, but if you take the biblical data at face value, then it would put it there in the 18th dynasty, as I've been arguing, in the midst of that whole story of the 18th dynasty in general. So anyway, if that's a little reminder to you of that, then hopefully that helps. All right, the temple is completed in 960. I was there. At least that's what my students think at school, you know. Mr. Gore, what did it really look like, you know? And so anyway, it looks something like that. That's one possible hypothesis. This is the great golden age. That moment when it was dedicated, of course, the wonderful prayer that's recorded for us in the Old Testament by Solomon is punctuated by God filling that temple with glory. It's a wonderful expression. The place was so thick with God's glory, the priests couldn't even labor in there. Isn't that a great description? Wouldn't you like to hear First Presbyterian Church was so filled with glory that the pastors couldn't even minister? Not that I don't like pastors ministering, but wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to just have such a deep, rich, dense sense of God's glory that we all, in a sense, are paralyzed in worship of this one? That seems to be what happened at that point, and it's a wonderful description. The Queen of Sheba shows up a few years later. Wonderful story again. The half was not told me, of course. Probably the beginning of Solomon's decline, marrying too many women, too many foreign gods are being imported, is probably about 940, and he dies in 930, just about the time the Assyrians start recovering. So there you are. The Assyrian recovery begins, and they will now become the dominant power in the ancient Near East for the next several hundred years. They are the force to be reckoned with. After them, it'll be the Babylonians. After them, it'll be the Persians. After them, it'll be the Greeks. After them, it'll be the Romans. It's a line of Gentile powers, and it all begins here with the Assyrians. They become the dominant power at this point. Israel and Judah divide, you know that story, and become a divided kingdom from this point on. They gradually lose power. This is also the point where we have the beginning of the ministry of the prophets. And the first of those Old Testament prophets, the first guy in a line, a succession of prophets that will continue all the way down to Malachi, the first of those prophets is named Elijah. All right, so he shows up, 9th century prophet, and then Elisha, and then we go on from there. This whole period of Assyrian recovery begins with a guy named Adad-Nirari II. Now here's what I want to do. I've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to be inching a little further into this. We'll pick up most of this next week, but I want to save time to give you the second half of my Sunday school lesson this morning, so hang on. But what I want to do is keep our eye on two different balls in play, one the Assyrians and one Israel. So we're going to kind of work together, both tracks, because they do intersect at a certain point, and we need to see kind of how we get there. So that's what I have in mind. So Adad-Nirari, not much to say about him, except he begins to be an empire builder. He's the beginning of Assyrian recovery. He moves Assyrian authority into the south, into Babylon. Although he treats it very cordially, the Assyrians always treated Babylon with a huge amount of reverential respect. It was always kind of viewed like a holy city for some reason, but nevertheless he asserts authority over it. In Judah, we have the next three kings during his reign. The first is Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. He trips up as a young man and, of course, provokes the rebellion. You know that story. Jerusalem is sacked by Shishak, the Egyptian pharaoh, in 925, makes off with a whole lot of the great wealth that Solomon had accumulated there. Otherwise, Rehoboam is not a bad king. He's given a fairly positive review. Abijam is the next one, only rules for a couple of years. And then good King Asa, right? The next king, 911 to 870. During his reign, many faithful migrate to Judah. They see the way the wind is blowing spiritually in the region of the 10 northern tribes, and so those 10 lost tribes were not lost. Many of them moved to Judah and preserved their identity there, even though, of course, eventually the northern tribes will be lost to the Assyrians. Asa leads the people of God in a great covenant renewal ceremony in 896, which is recorded for us in the Old Testament. In the north, Jeroboam is the rebel. He sparks the rebellion against the house of David and establishes then the 10 northern tribes, what's usually called Israel. So you have Judah and Israel. In order to try to prevent or at least dissuade people from going to Jerusalem to worship, he very conveniently sets up some nice golden calves. Isn't that great? So the people could worship right in their backyard. It was just nice, you know. You had these nice golden calves. It was a great place to worship, and they didn't have to bother going to Jerusalem. And so he sets those up, setting a bad precedent, of course, in Israel that will continue more or less unabated until Israel is finally deported. The next ruler of Assyria is Tukulti-Ninurta, 891 to 884. He consolidates gains. He's continuing to build the Assyrian power. He rebuilds the walls of Ashur. Asa is continuing to reign in Judah. Israel is beginning to show considerable instability. You've got a succession of fairly short-term kings, Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Omri, who will be the father of Ahab, as you know. And so things are not looking so good in the north. There's a certain amount of stability in the south. Assyria is continuing to grow and expand its power. Next guy is Ashurnazirpal II. Again, looks like all the others to me, but there he is. Renowned for his brutality. In fact, even the History Channel did a little snippet on this guy not too long ago, discussing how brutal he was. He was unprecedented in the ghastly forms of torture that he meted out on those who he was trying to conquer. He was a great empire builder. He treated Babylon with respect. He expanded Assyrian domains into Syria, which is to the north of Israel. He made peace with the Phoenicians. In Judah, we have Asa wrapping up in 870. Jehoshaphat, another good king, ruling from 870 to 848. The only thing he does that's a little questionable is he allies with Ahab, the king in the north. On the other side, we have Ahab, the son of Omri. And of course, this is where we have Elijah introduced. So about 861, Elijah shows up, announces a great famine. It's going to last for 3 years. Puts Elijah on the most wanted list, in ancient Israel. In 857, he returns. You have that great conflict between Elijah and the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. Fire comes down. You recall that story. Elijah is also told to anoint 3 people. Okay, wake up now. The first of them is Jehu. The second of them, he's going to be the king of Israel. The second of them is Hazael. He will be the king of Syria. The third of them is Elisha. He will be the successor to Elijah. So Elijah's going to anoint these 3, and then he'll be taken up, of course, in a fiery chariot and all that story. Ahab takes Naboth's vineyard in 856. He dies in battle with the Syrians in 853. This brings us to Shalmaneser. Another good-looking guy. This is a statue of him at the British Museum. In 35 years of reign, he undertook 31 campaigns, so you can tell what he was doing in his spare time. Continued his policies of respect toward Babylon. He attacks Syria. And in the process, Hazael, who had been anointed by Elijah, assassinates the king, Ben-Hadad, who's mentioned in the Old Testament. Hazael himself gets locked into Damascus, the capital of Syria. And, interestingly, Jehu, who became the ruler of Israel, pays tribute to Shalmaneser III, and that's recorded for us in a great artifact that was found by Austin Henry Layard when he was doing his archaeological work there in the region of Assyria, and it's called the Black Obelisk. This is what it looks like. It's at the British Museum. Discovered in 1846. It's very interesting to us because it's the earliest artifact that has a picture of an Israelite ruler inscribed upon it. And that is very interesting. And the Israelite ruler who's mentioned here coincides perfectly with the Assyrian story of what's going on. So the biblical account and the Assyrian account at this point are in point-for-point agreement. The Israelite king is Jehu. The inscription that's included here reads as follows: "The tribute of Jehu, son of Omri, I received from him silver, gold, a golden bowl, a golden vase with pointed bottom, golden tumblers, golden buckets, 10, a staff for a king, and spears." Sounds like something for a wedding planner, doesn't it? But that's what it says. So there it is. The image that shows Jehu is here. Can you see that? Jehu's the guy on his hands and knees. That's Shalmaneser to the left, standing up. I hope you can all see that. I want you to pay special attention to that. And here's what I want you to think about. Israel has been gradually distancing itself from a posture of obedience to God. It wanted to get free from the constraints of the God of Israel. It found Yahweh to be too demanding. It wanted to experience a certain degree of liberty. And whenever we start playing that game, we are going to find ourselves in a whole new kind of slavery. And here is a king who was supposed to be the king of the people of God. He was supposed to be the one who is actually carrying the very sanction of God. And he's bowing in a kind of abject, groveling posture before a pagan ruler and his false god. Now, the lesson for us, my friends, is simply this. There is a kind of poetic justice in the way God runs the universe. God has said to us He wants us to enslave ourselves to Him. Be slaves of righteousness, Paul says. Be slaves of Christ. Some people don't like the idea of being a slave to God. Oh, I don't want to be a slave. And so we decide in the name of freedom we will put something else where God belongs. And you know what? We still wind up slaves. This kind of rich, poetic justice is expressed by Paul in Romans chapter 1 when he says God gave them over to their own lusts. And whenever we put anything where God belongs, we will find ourselves not free, but enslaved to that thing. And so the lesson is, when a man's ways please the Lord, He'll make even his enemies to be at peace with him. But when we start opening a little bit of wiggle room for ourselves and say, well, I'm just not going to let God rule in this part of my life, you're going to find that this part of your life will begin to rule you. And sometimes that can be a very painful lesson to learn, and I know some of you in this room have learned that lesson once or twice, as have I. That the greatest liberty, ironically, that we'll ever experience is when we absolutely declare Christ is my King, God is my sovereign, and He utterly commands my life by His rightful authority. And there, in that apparent slavery, is the greatest freedom we can ever discover. Amen?